So last couple of topics I want to talk about are one, the different versions or the different possibilities of natural selection. So natural selection, also known as what? Survival of the fittest. And so what you get is the only type of actually adaptive microevolution, right? We talked about that in this chapter. What are other forces of microevolution? Just as a review. What are other forces of microevolution? Yeah, Carrie. Genetic drift and, yeah, Emma. Gene flow. So we have three mechanisms. Natural selection, genetic drift, gene flow. And natural selection is the only one that's adaptive. Meaning, it's the only one equipped to make the population better fit, right? More fit for its environment. The natural selection basically comes in three forms, and this is what's called directional, balancing, and disruptive. This sometimes has different names. Sometimes this is called stabilizing. Let me see how. Stabilizing. I prefer to use the term balancing because then it actually gives you a nice reference to what you expect to find when your distribution is not continuous, but instead is discrete. Yeah, Lisa. Yes, and I'm going to show you what they each look like. So we'll put together a graph for each. On the y-axis for each of these three graphs is going to be proportion of population. Okay, so the y-axis on all three graphs, same measurement, proportion of population. And the x-axis on all three graphs is the same measurement as well. And let's represent the x-axis on all three as size, and we'll give this some units. And so this might be beak size. The example in the text gives you color. And so the units of color would not be centimeters, but would be something else. And so in directional selection, so here, let's go ahead and draw the initial conditions. And remember, if we've got natural selection at work, our population is evolving, right? There's microevolution, and in this case, it is adaptive. In directional...
Is the first thing the original?
Yes. Yep, so the solid is the original. The dashed is the new populations. It's a good question. So in directional, your average condition is shifting. In this case, larger, but it could very easily shift smaller as well. Yeah, Mark.
So for the graph, like is size for all the x-axis and portion of the population for all the y?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So one form is directional selection, and that's your average size is increasing or decreasing. It's moving in a particular direction. Why we call it directional. Balancing or stabilizing. Your average condition isn't changing. A higher proportion, bless you, a higher proportion of your population now has the average condition. Okay? So your average condition doesn't change, just the proportion of your population with that average condition changes. And then disruptive, what do you think this is going to look like? Whack. Wow. Is that what you said? Whack. And so what you get is, again, like in stabilizing selection or balancing, your average condition typically is not changing, but a smaller percentage of your population has the average condition.
Are there different types of gene flow and
Drift, I mean, yeah, so drift is random.
yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, drift can do pretty much anything to your average condition. Gene flow is somewhat random as well, is determined by whatever your source population is. So if you're bringing in individuals, typically where you see gene flow is in relatively isolated populations getting more individuals, like islands getting more individuals from the mainland. And so there you're typically going to see a shift as well. It's less predictable, so we don't usually try to illustrate it. All right, so these are 3 different types of natural selection, and I want you to know you're in this case in terms of size, this is a continuous variation. Continuous variation, and what we mean by that is basically anything is possible in between, the 2 extremes, right? You've got the smallest individuals and the largest individuals, and anything in between is possible, right? Yeah, Katie.
Can you explain disruptive again?
Yeah, so in disruptive, your average condition typically is not changing, but a smaller proportion of the population has that average condition, and you start to favor the extremes.
Okay.
So in this case, we're favoring the extremes. Before, our original population, a very small proportion had this size. Now a much larger proportion has the small size. Very small proportion with the large size. Now a larger proportion with the large size. And very few individuals with the average condition. This is fun to start talking about why this might happen. But so continuous variation, any value between the extremes is possible. Okay, so this is what a continuous variation means. And so size is going to be something that varies continuously. What else is going to vary continuously? What else might vary continuously in addition to size? I mentioned just in passing. Well, so yeah, the proportion is what we're measuring. But the one in the textbook uses color. Thank you, Rick. So color is another one that oftentimes can vary continuously. It doesn't always, right? Sometimes you get 2 morphs. You get brown or tan, or brown or black, or brown or white. Okay? But most of the time, color is a continuous variation. Any other ideas? So we've got size, quantity, maybe, but for yeah, we'll leave it there. All right. The other type of variation is called discrete variation. And in discrete variation, it's either or. Either or. Okay? You either have one character or not character. You either have one trait or you have the other trait. There's not a continuous variation. In discrete variation, it's either or. So there tend to be 2 morphs, right? And it's either or. Either you're the brown morph or you're the tan morph, okay? There's no, you see that a lot with small rodents. You were trying to think, where does Dr. Engel fit in that, right? Neither morph. Isa.
I was going outside, so that's funny.
We are going to go outside today.
Yay.
Yeah.
When it comes to us humans, it's not either or, it's neither or.
Yeah.
Neither or.
Okay, so does discrete make sense?
Yeah.
So it's either or. Like you either have one character or you have the other. It's not a continuous variation. Okay? All right, may I erase this top part? Yeah, Michelle.
I just have a question about the content.
Yeah.
Could you explain like the definition in your own words?
Yeah, so continuous variation would be something where you basically any value is possible. So a lot of times, like weight in small mammals is oftentimes a continuous variation, where your smallest individual say weighs 5 grams, your largest individual weighs 7 grams, and any value between there is possible. Right? They could weigh 6 grams, they could weigh 5.5 grams, they could weigh 5.2 grams.
Or just the extreme one.
Well, it's just any value in between the extremes is possible. Right? Whereas discrete, if it were discrete, you could only weigh 5 grams or 7 grams. You couldn't weigh anything in between. Weight's not going to work that way, but there are some characters that do work that way.
What
Yeah,
would
Rick.
be an example of that?
Usually, a lot of the times, different color morphs aren't continuously varying. They're discrete.
Okay.
There's not like a continuous. So the example given is in mice that basically anything varies from like tan all the way to dark, depending on the amount of pigment that's laid down. And so there's a continuous variation there depending on the amount of pigment, but it doesn't always work that way. Color oftentimes is discrete.
Is it like cows where it's like either black and white or you're brown, like that?
Yeah, sure. Yep. Okay. So then we have a question of why do we maintain discrete variation?
Wait, as in like humans?
Just in general. You can do it for humans and that's fine.
Oh, like how do people either have one or how do things either have one or the other?
So, continuous variation, if you've got something like, so let's use humans as an example. They're more familiar. So, what's a human character that's going to have a continuous distribution?
And noses.
No, what about the noses? Like the size of the nose?
No.
They're all
Okay.
gonna have 2 nostrils.
No, like, okay, no, hair.
Hair, but what about hair? Hair color?
Sure.
Hair color, yeah, I mean, it's continuous. It's not as obviously continuous as, say, height, right?
Perfect.
Let's use human height. Human height is like the textbook continuous variation, right? You've got the shortest human alive, which I would imagine is probably somewhere around 2 feet tall. And then you have the tallest living human, imagine somewhere around 8.5 feet tall. And anything in between is possible, right? You could be 5'10", you could be 5'11", you could be 5'10 3/4, you could be right? You could be 5'11 3/4, you could be like Baker Mayfield, 6 feet and 3/8 of an inch, right? And so anything in between those extremes is possible, right? And so you get a nice continuous variation. What about discrete characters in humans? So what's something that has discrete variation in humans? Michelle.
Is it like some people's tongue they can like curve it and some people's tongue can't?
No, it's the tongue.
Yeah.
You're talking about, yes, absolutely.
Oh, that's
Right?
cool.
It's like you can either
They do the tongue
yeah.
thing? No, not
You
that
can
one,
make-
the cool one.
Oh, the clover leaf. Yeah, that's crazy. Or you can do like hitchhiker's thumb or no hitchhiker's thumb, right? So we have some discrete variation. Yeah.
Like biggest one, the biggest one I can think of is just like
I was
the
so
biggest one I can think of is just the difference between male and female.
Okay, so that one's a little bit more complicated. Yeah, but that's not necessarily the same thing as what we're talking about with discrete variation. When you're talking about sex determination, it gets a little bit more complicated. But we've got like hitchhiker's thumb,
Whoa,
not
you got a
hitchhiker's
major
thumb.
one.
Widow's peak, not widow's peak, right? You can roll your tongue. You can't roll your tongue. All right.
It's a little like
So why do we maintain this discrete variation? And a more interesting question is why do we maintain the discrete variation when it impacts fitness? So like hitchhiker's thumb, and not a hitchhiker's thumb, that's not going to impact your fitness at all, right? The fact that I can, bend my thumb back has no impact on my relative fitness. Okay? Yeah.
Where's Widow's Peak?
A widow's peak is when your hairline comes to a point in the middle.
Oh, no.
All right? Yeah.
What's an example of a discrete variation that does impact fitness?
For humans we're complicated because very little has a large influence on our fitness. But I would say like maybe polydactyly, right? Having 5 fingers or 6. While having 6 fingers may not help you survive any worse than having 5 fingers, it may make you less likely to reproduce. Just putting that out there, okay? So there are 2 reasons. There are 2 reasons how you can maintain discrete variation even when it impacts fitness. If it doesn't impact fitness, it doesn't matter. So it shouldn't. You would expect to have that variation maintained because there's no impact on fitness. But if it impacts fitness, okay, you can maintain variation for 2 reasons. One is what's called heterozygous advantage. And so this is if you have both versions of the gene, you are more fit than individuals that have 2 of the same copy. Heterozygous advantage. So being PQ is better than P squared and Q squared. Okay, so being PQ is for some reason better than being P squared or Q squared. And the textbook example of this is sickle cell trait. Anyone know sickle cell anemia? So sickle cell anemia is caused by a mutation in one of the genes that codes for one of the proteins in hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is a complex protein that carries oxygen, right? Do y'all remember that? We'll talk about hemoglobin, don't worry. We'll get there. But it's a complex protein that carries oxygen. So a single mutation in one of the protein pieces leads to a change in red blood cell shape. Instead of being round like a donut shape, it becomes sickle shaped, almost like a crescent moon, and it doesn't carry oxygen as well. But if you are heterozygous, you do not have sickle cell anemia, you have what's called sickle cell trait, and you're resistant to getting malaria. So you don't have the disease, but you also are much less likely to contract malaria. So in areas where malaria is very common, you have an advantage to being heterozygous. You don't have the disease, but you're resistant to malaria. Yeah, Emma.
So if you have sickle cell anemia, are you like 100% that you'll get your cells will change to sickle cell?
Yes. Oh yeah. If you've got 2 copies of the bad mutate, yes, you will have sickle cell anemia. And so the biggest issue there is clotting. Your blood just doesn't flow very easily because the red blood cells are crescent shaped and they tend to clump together. And so you have a lot of clotting issues. Although you're also not going to carry oxygen as well, and so that's an issue as well. Now, James Harrison, do any of you know who James Harrison is? He was a linebacker for the Pittsburgh Steelers for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
And then he played a couple games for the New England Patriots, and then he retired. Okay? But anyways, he had sickle cell trait. And so the only pathology he had was he couldn't play whenever they went to Denver. At high elevations, enough of his red blood cells had issues carrying oxygen that he couldn't play at the high elevation. But other than that, he would be far more resistant to malaria than somebody without sickle cell trait. Now, living in North America, malaria is not as big of an issue.
Okay,
But
I'm kind of confused. What do you mean by 2 copies of the bad trait? So does that mean your parent gave you one bad copy and your other parent gave you
yes,
one bad copy?
yep, that from both parents you got a bad copy of that gene. So
Okay.
you're
And
making.
what do you mean by bad copy?
It means it's not making the proper protein.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then
No.
wouldn't that make it
No, because you want to be.
No.
Oh, well, yeah.
Yes, if you have both from the same parent, then you are homozygous dominant for that sickle cell for the sickle cell trait. But if you're heterozygous, you have one bad copy that came from either your mom or your dad, and then you have one normal copy.
Oh, and then that means you're better.
Right. Well, if you live in an area where malaria is common. If you don't live in an area where malaria is common, there's no advantage to being heterozygous. In fact, you can't play whenever you go to Denver, and so it's tough. Emma.
So I know you can like cure some forms of anemia, like if the dog has some bleeds and then like they're anemic, we can like fix it. So can you?
You can treat sickle cell anemia. You can't cure it.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can treat it to try to prevent the clotting issues, and then you can, supplement and try to make it more efficient at carrying oxygen. You can induce them to make more red blood cells, but you can treat it. You can't cure it, unless you like genetically engineer them to be able to make the proper protein. The other one is called frequency dependent selection. So again, one way to maintain it is heterozygous advantage. If heterozygous individuals have some advantage, you're going to maintain both forms. Yeah, Michelle.
Just have a question about discrete variation. So for human, in Asia, there's a lot of people has like single eyelid. Is that and like here, most of us have like double eyelid. Is that considered discrete variation?
Yes, most likely, but I'm not familiar with that character. So, but it sounds like it would be a discrete variation.
Oh yeah.
So the other one is frequency dependent selection. Something is advantageous because it's rare. Something is advantageous when rare. And why on earth might that be the case? Why would there be some advantage to a trait just because it's rare? Yeah, Katie.
Because it's they need every single one of those traits to survive, like for the trait to keep going.
Maybe. Usually see this play out with heavy predation. And so this, again, this is discrete variation. And so let's say you have two different color morphs, right? You have the common color morph, and then you have the rare color morph. If you're a predator, it doesn't make sense to become really good at finding that rare color morph, right? Because it's rare, right? It doesn't provide you any advantage to be able to get better at finding that. You should get better at finding the common color morph. Right? And so this is an example of frequency dependent selection. You may have an advantage because you have that rare morph. Predators don't look for you. They may not even recognize you as food, even if they saw you. Okay? And then so it kind of maintains a small number of that rare morph just because they don't get preyed on as heavily. Yeah, Michelle.
Wait, so the color morph, is that animal uses like changing colors?
No, this wouldn't be changing colors. This would be set. They're just two different colors that species has. Right? Some individuals say are brown, other individuals are tan. Right? It's not they're changing colors throughout their life. It's either or. Right? Discrete variation has to be either or. But in some cases, that rare morph may be selected for just because predators don't recognize it as food. Or they don't become really good at finding that morph because it's rare. Kyle and then Emma.
So wouldn't that make it not rare? So if predator, let's say the predator.
Over time, it could shift it in favor of that non-rare. But in a lot of these examples, the females prefer the dominant morph because that's what's going to make their male offspring more likely to find female mates. So they'll keep selecting for that dominant morph, and then the predators are shifting it towards that rare morph. But usually, it's the female choice is powerful enough to keep the dominant morph to stay the dominant morph, and the rare morph just sticks around because they don't get eaten as often. Right? They don't reproduce nearly as often, but they don't get eaten as often, so they live a little bit longer. And even though they reproduce, say, only 1 in every 5 times the dominant morph does, they maybe live long enough to keep that morph alive. Emma.
What allows chameleons to change colors?
Yeah, there are cells, they have cell types that a lot of organisms have called chromatophores that change the distribution of pigment. They just have a lot of them. They have a lot of those cells that change the distribution of pigment. And so if you change where pigment is located, it manipulates how light is absorbed and reflected off of your tissues.
And then
Yeah.
how does our body recognize, like, say for example, there's something like a purple plant, and then they change
It seems to match the same frequency of light being emitted by whatever the object is. And so octopi do the same thing, although octopi have no ability to see color. Resume. Okay. So again, chapter 24, it takes it to basically ask the question, can microevolution generate new species? Okay, we've already talked about microevolution, right? What is microevolution? Katie.
It's a change in allele frequency.
Change in allele frequencies. Chapter 24 is all about speciation. Yeah,
Are you moving on to chapter 24?
we are to chapter 24.
Right, this is chapter 24.
This is chapter 24.
Gotcha.
And so speciation is the origin of a new species. Okay, so speciation is the origin of a new species. Whoa. Species. Okay, the origin of a new species. Yeah.
What's the name of
The origin of species. Okay. And so the question is, and what chapter 24 is all about is how does this happen, right? This, in many ways, is the focal point of evolutionary theory, is the formation of new species. Do any of you remember what Charles Darwin's book is called? On the Origin of Species. Okay. Now, what's interesting is species is in many ways, it is a man-made idea to organize living forms, right? I don't think living forms care all that much about our ability to classify them as one or several species. And so, because it is a man-made concept, there are some challenges into trying to figure out exactly what we mean by that term. Isa.
So you know how like there's different species of butterflies and
I do, yes.
So humans we're just one species.
Correct.
So one love, you know?
Although I think unnecessarily so,
Yeah.
some human fossils are classified as separate species and probably should not be. For example, Neanderthals,
What's that?
Homo neanderthalensis.
Cavemen.
No, not cavemen. Cavemen are our species, but they're Cro-Magnon man. Anyway, same species, different subspecies. But Neanderthals and our species interbred. So if you are of European descent or have any European lineage, you are probably anywhere from 4 to 7% Neanderthal.
What is a Neanderthal?
That's a wonderful question.
Oh,
It's like the three.
Yeah, Tori.
So, okay, so Adam and Eve were the first people like on the earth
Correct.
because God created them. So I'm kind of confused on like where cavemen fit into that because after Adam and Eve it's like Canaan. Like how does that work?
We can talk about that. We need to wait until we get into chapter 26 and we talk about phylogenies because you need to be equipped to handle looking at a phylogeny and interpreting all of the information from it before we can have that conversation.
Yes.
We'll talk about that.
How do you fit into this? Because you're a Christian and
We'll talk about that.
evolution and stuff.
We'll talk about that. Okay, relax. We're not ready to have those conversations yet. Right now, we've talked about microevolution. We're talking about forming new species. Chapter 25 and 26 are all about macroevolution. And that's where it starts to get get more complicated. Okay.
Speciation, micro.
Speciation would still be microevolution. Yep. Yep. Speciation would still be a form of microevolution. And so that's what chapter 24 is trying to get at of the how does this happen. It's basically microevolution to the point where these are no longer the same species, right? So two populations diverge enough that the two populations are no longer the same species. Okay? So speciation, the origin of a new species. Again, this is in many ways the focal point of evolution, and chapter 24 is entirely about how. How does this happen? Okay? And I know you want to ask other questions, and we'll deal with those questions, but in chapters 25 and 26. Okay? All right. So first thing we have to do before we start talking about species is continue the conversation we had outside. And that's basically the answer to this question. What is a species? What is a species? And this, you will find, is not a very easy question to answer. It is not a very easy question to answer. And so we have several different strategies that we can use to try to do this. We can use one, it's called the morphological, or typological. So morphological or typological species is basically this. If they look alike, now this is a very simple way to describe this definition, all right? If they look alike, they are the same species, okay? Now that is a very simplified idea, or description of that, but it basically boils down to that. If they look alike, then they're the same species. And we talked about outside, there are some challenges to that because sometimes things look alike and they are not the same species. We saw that time and time again in our chapter where we talked about mimicry, something fueled by heavy amounts of predation. Right? Species want to look like things that are more dangerous to avoid being eaten. And then another challenge is sometimes things look very different, but they are the same species. Sometimes there's an enormous amount of variation within a species. You see this with black bears. Okay, black bears can be anywhere from really dark black to extremely light brown. And then you can get albino, but those are weird morphs. But you have things that they're black bears, but they are not black. They're tiny brown bears. Yeah.
So a moth and a butterfly, what is that?
Two completely different groupings
So, like,
altogether.
there's similarities.
They do, yeah. They're in the same order. So you all know your ranks, right? Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. They're the same order of insects, but different groups within that. Yeah, it's a good question. All right, so morphological has some issues. So then we have what's called the biological species concept. And this basically says if they can mate, they're the same species. All right. So the biological species concept is basically this. If they can mate, then they're the same species. And if they can mate, it needs to be meaningful, right? They need to be able to produce offspring that are viable and can reproduce themselves. All right. Can you think of any challenges to this way of defining a species?
Which one?
The biological. Yeah, Lydia. Okay, so like, what if they can mate, but only if we make it happen, right? There's some way they're isolated behaviorally, so they don't mate, but they can, right? So then it's like, well, they can mate and form viable offspring, but they don't. They're behaviorally isolated. Should we really consider them part of the same species? Yeah, Emma.
So if you were to do that, like, okay, because I know, like, in humans, if, like, two people are closely related and they produce offspring, even if they have, like, some deformities,
Maybe, potentially, it depends. Because if you're more likely to pass on genetic illnesses the more closely you are related. It's not a guarantee, though.
It's like the same case in animals.
Yes, but animals tend to have more variation than humans do. We have a very small amount of genetic variation. Although we talked about cheetahs, right? Was that last time or was it the time before that?
Last time.
Yeah, where cheetahs are, if you take any two random cheetahs, they're probably going to be more closely related to each other than you are to your siblings. But they also have very low incidence of genetic illness, other than they have a lot of issues, like physiological issues. They don't live a long time, and they're just not really all that great. Yeah, Isa.
How fast did it go from like standing to like the maximum?
Very fast, almost instantaneously.
Like 0 to 100.
Well, they drive. They can run like 65 to 70 miles per hour, and they can get there almost instantly. All right, another issue with the biological. Tori, are you going to give us another issue with this, or are you going to ask a question? I don't remember this. This is comment. Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Question. What is the comment? Okay. Yeah. All right. So, what about for species that only reproduce asexually?
What is that?
Asexual reproduction means that they just make copies of themselves.
So like,
So a lot of sponges are that way, that are animals that only reproduce asexually. What are those insects that lady beetles eat? Aphids. Aphids only reproduce asexually.
so they just produce themselves.
Yeah, basically copies of themselves. Different ways. Aphids do it by the females produce eggs that are already have 2 copies of the genome, and then they just develop into new females. So you can't really apply this concept to an animal that doesn't reproduce sexually, right? Because they don't breed with anyone, and yet they're all, presumably members of the same species. So if you would try to apply this concept to an organism that only reproduces asexually, every individual is a separate species, because they don't interbreed with anyone. Yeah, Emma.
How do some animals change gender?
Because sex in those animals is not determined by chromosomes. So in mammals and birds, sex is determined by the presence of a specific type of chromosome. In some other animals, the environmental conditions or behavioral conditions determine gender. And so if those conditions switch, then it'll lead to a different collection of hormones. Yeah, this is a good question. Another issue is you can't use this with fossil forms, right? You can't get dead animals to reproduce, right? And so that's another issue with the biological species concept. So under this is probably the most popular of all of the species concepts. And under this, we have to start to think about, okay, what types of barriers are there to reproduction? What types of barriers to reproduction? And we have to know what happens when 2 species hybridize. And so if they can and they do reproduce, but there's something about that hybrid that makes it less fit than either individual, we would still consider them different species, even though, according to this, they're the same species, right? If they can mate, they're the same species, unless when they mate, they produce something that is less vigorous than either individual by themselves. All right. Okay, we okay here? I want to give you a couple of other definitions or ways to define a species that are less popular, less widely used. One is ecological. And this basically says if they fill the same niche, they are the same species. Remember, we've talked about niche before when we talked about niche partitioning and competition among species, right? There's one more, but I'm going to save it until we talk about chapter 25 and 26. it's in chapter 24, but we need to be equipped with some information from 25 and 26 before we can handle that other definition. All right? So are these three okay? Another challenge to here is if you want to determine if two individuals are part of the same species, you're waiting to see if they mate. You have to also remember that sometimes females want a certain characteristic in the male, and so they won't reproduce with them even if they are the same species because they don't have the characteristic that they're looking for, right? Their dance isn't just right. All right, can I erase this? Or I'm sorry, may I erase it? Because you really can't answer the question, can I? May I?
I think you're biologically existing.
I mean, you could be like, yeah, I'm pretty sure you can, but I'm really the only one that can answer that question, can I? All right. So, I want you all to take about a minute or so, working with those around you. I want you to come up with some things that will isolate two populations reproductively. Okay? What are some things that will keep populations from being able to reproduce? Okay? Is it differences in where they're located, right? And then some other features. All right? I already gave you one. It's called habitat isolation. They live in different places. Okay? Give me some more. Take a minute, give me some more ways in which things are isolated.
That's a good one. I like it. That's smart, man. Thinking outside the box. I like it.
Hi, Tori. You gotta help the people come up with some things that isolate populations.
Maybe.
Migration
system
all the nations.
Do you mean like physically separate them?
Could be physically, it could be something else. Could be spatially.
Like biologically?
All of the above. Anything that isolate.
Spiritually.
Spiritually.
I mean,
And they're the same species?
No.
humans have souls.
No.
Because if they're reproductively isolated, they are different species according to the biological species.
So literally everything.
Yeah, so what keeps lions from reproducing with tigers?
They're not in the same spot.
Okay, so that's habitat isolation. That's one I already gave to you.
Oh. Same gender. Good job, man. That's a good one. They don't like each other. It's like
Migration.
I have to draw them.
All right. Okay, do we have some? We have two categories of isolation. I don't even know what you would want to call barriers. Okay, of isolation barriers. That seems redundant. We have two different categories of barriers. We have what are called pre-zygotic barriers, and we have post-zygotic barriers. What's a zygote? It is. It's when the sperm fertilizes the ovum, you produce a zygote. Okay? So pre-zygotic, meaning that you can't even, the sperm cannot fertilize the ovum. So we've got some pre-zygotic barriers. And what are some, I already gave you one. One of these is habitat. Habitat isolation. They don't live in the same place. Right? The reason why lions and tigers don't mate, lions, tigers, and bears are mine. It's because they don't live in the same place. What are some other barriers? Yeah.
It's like their behaviors.
Yeah. Behavioral isolation. Their dances are different, or their songs are different, right? You see this a lot with songbirds. Yeah, Issa.
I guess this is kind of like habitat isolation, but I was thinking something like, like ice age, like broke apart continents
Okay. Yeah, so that would be what you would call a vicariance event generating habitat isolation. Yeah. Emma.
So like if a bird is mute and like it's a songbird,
Oh, that's not good. If a male songbird cannot sing, he will not find a mate. Unless he can try to sneak matings or force copulations. But if he can't sing, he can't attract a mate. Another one is temporal.
What does that mean?
Temporal isolation. I'm glad you asked, Kyle. Was that Kyle?
Yeah.
Temporal isolation means that they do not reproduce at the same time. You see this a lot with plants, where similar species of plants will flower at different times of the year. So like the reason why they don't reproduce is because they form their reproductive structures at different times of the year. You'll see this with animals as well, where maybe their breeding season is just slightly off. Primates are unusual. Primates and then domesticated dogs do this as well, but most mammals reproduce one time a year. Females come into estrus when they're actually releasing ova once a year, and that's it. Now you have some small rodents that will come into estrus multiple times, but a lot of mammals it's just once. And so even if it's only 2 weeks apart, say females of one species come into estrus at the beginning of May, and the others come into estrus at the middle of May, it's enough to isolate the two species. Yeah, Tori.
Okay, so this is kind of like off topic, but it kind of had something to do with Emma's question, so I'm gonna ask it.
Okay.
So, you know, like how all the world is like spread apart, broken apart, but you said it's coming back together, kind of.
Oh, you're talking about the continents,
Yeah.
like Pangea, it separates and then came back together.
That like when God flooded the world, do you think that had a bigger impact on the spreading of the continents?
Yes. I think that was probably the initial event to begin the flood was the breaking up of a continental plate.
Oh, the breaking up.
Not the of Pangea, but of something before Pangea.
So
But anyways,
the flood started that,
that started the flood.
but God started the flood.
Correct. Using
God
that.
did that to start the flood.
Yes. That was that was one of the initial events is shifting in continental plates.
And how does that cause rain?
Well, so rain was another factor happening at the beginning. But yeah, I don't know if we'll have time to talk about it. Save this question for. Oh, you know what? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that in chapter 26 as well when we're talking about because in 25 and 26 we'll talk about the fossil record. We can talk about that. Another one is mechanical isolation. So this is they don't reproduce because they physically can't. Okay? Their behavior may not isolate them. They live in the same place. They reproduce at the same time. But just mechanically, it doesn't work. Okay? And then the other one is gametic isolation. So they're not behaviorally isolated. They're not temporally isolated. They're not spatially isolated. They aren't mechanically isolated, but their gametes won't fuse. Okay, their gametes just won't fuse. The sperm cannot fertilize the ova.
Did you just go under mechanical?
No, because mechanical is more just like the pieces don't fit together. So we separate. I mean, they're similar, right? It's like they're not. They'll try. I mean, under both these categories, they will try to reproduce. So these two you find in typically in very closely related species. They were separated long enough to develop into separate species, and then they're brought back together, and so they'll try to reproduce. But there's enough difference that it doesn't work. So it is a meaningful difference between the two. But yeah, I mean they are both they're trying to reproduce and they just can't. All right. Does this make sense for pre-zygotic? So the zygote never forms. Post-zygotic, the zygote forms, but something is wrong with that hybrid. Okay? And so we have 3 different types of post-zygotic barriers. One is called reduced viability. The hybrids that form, so again, the zygote forms and it develops, but this individual that develops is just they don't survive as well. They don't survive as well. Reduced viability. They don't survive as well. They don't survive as long, or they aren't as able to handle environmental issues. Yeah, Lydia. Yeah, so absolutely. They have lower fitness than either species on their own, but they have lower fitness because they don't survive as well. This one is reduced fitness as well. This is reduced fertility. So both of these are basically, fitness is lower in the hybrid than it is in either species. The first one is because they don't survive as well. The second one is because they don't reproduce as well. Okay, reduced fertility. Yeah, Michelle.
Could you explain post-zygote?
Post-zygote, so the zygote forms. So a baby is born. So you have two different species. When they mate, they can form a baby, but the baby has reduced fitness.
Oh, so so are you saying if it's the species that is post?
Yes. Yep. The other one is called hybrid breakdown. And in hybrid breakdown, you have viable, fertile offspring. So they survive just as well. They reproduce just as well. But there's just the species that forms has basically a clock on it. There's only a certain number of generations that can form before that new species goes extinct. There's something wrong, but it's not so clear as that the individuals don't survive as long and that the individuals aren't reproducing as well. It's not as clear. Okay, they're forming viable offspring. Their viability is fine. Their fertility is fine, but there's just something off, and they usually only survive for a couple of generations and then disappear. Maybe they have a very limited amount of genetic diversity. Okay, Emma.
It's kind of off topic, but,
Okay, we've been having a lot of off-topic questions. Okay.
So when a woman is pregnant, if they can't ingest alcohol, how does that?
You can, but you just have to do it in moderation.
So if you drink a lot of it, how does cause the baby to have something wrong with it?
Well, yeah. So it's a good question. So the material from mom's blood mixes with material from the infant's blood. A lot of material will cross the placenta, and so will go from mom's blood into baby's blood. The bloods don't directly mix, but material diffuses out of mom's blood into baby's blood. That's how baby feeds, right? Mm-hmm. So baby's not eating while it's inside the womb, because what would it eat? But anyway, so it's getting material diffusing over from mom's blood, and alcohol can diffuse over that, and then the baby's, so it's just making, our livers, when you have alcohol in your system, have to detoxify that alcohol. And we have enzymes in our liver that do that, but it stresses your liver. And so when you stress the liver of a rapidly developing, rapidly growing individual, it's not good. Right, it's just it puts their bodies under a lot of stress. Yeah, Isa. So the placenta is very nutrient dense, and so there's a lot you can do with that. Some people will put it into capsules and then will consume it to get those nutrients back. Some people make a stew with it.
Like a
Smoothie. Yeah. It's just a lot of those are influenced by one, yes, there are some health benefits to it, but I think a lot of them are influenced by a little bit more of almost like a spiritual experience. Yeah. Anyways. All right. So, we've already talked about some issues of the biological species concept. We just introduced another issue to the biological species concept. Do you see it? Do you see the additional issue? So these post-zygotic barriers. The individuals, they're reproducing. According to the biological species concept, if they can reproduce, they are the same species. And yet, there's something weird about these hybrids, and so they're technically the same species, but, yeah, Katie.
Because they aren't going to be surviving.
Yeah, so it's like it forces us to actually make our biological species concept or the definition more complicated. Because now we can't just say, if they can reproduce, they're the same species. Now we have to say, if they can reproduce and form viable, fertile offspring that are capable of surviving for multiple generations, then they're the same species.
So you don't know. You can't just
Yeah, so it makes our definition a lot more complicated, right?
Makes sense.
It's not. It does make sense, but it makes it more. And who wants a definition that long, right? So if I ask you on the exam, let's say I ask you on the exam 6 days from now, a question about the biological species concept, right? I don't expect you to write if the two species can reproduce and form viable, fertile offspring that will survive for multiple generations, then they're the same species. That's a really complicated definition. It's accurate, but it's not entirely helpful. What I would expect you to write is if the two species can reproduce, if the two individuals can reproduce, then they're the same species, and then put a little asterisk and say some exceptions. Some exceptions apply. Okay? Is that all right? It's just like the I before E except after C, and then you put a little asterisk and you say some exceptions apply.
Or when it's sounding like A as a neighbor.
Yeah. Yeah. So some exceptions apply, right? So you just made my definition more complicated. I don't like that, right? We want to keep definitions nice and simple, and then just note that there are some exceptions that apply. The one in the textbook, it gives you grizzly bears and polar bears, two different species in the same genus, Ursus, that they can and do reproduce and form hybrids called growler bears. Yeah. Yeah.
What colors do they come in?
They're pretty white with some brown highlights.
I see you drawing.
Why are you drawing this?
Everyone will have
It's nice to know that you're not having to work hard enough in this to keep you busy.
I'm taking notes too.
I'll give you some more work, Rick. Don't you worry.
What time is it?
In our Google Classroom, I'll start a separate module called Rick, and all of those assignments apply only to Rick. Okay, you guys don't need to worry about them. All right. It is 9:32. There we go. There's a growler bear. So here's a grizzly bear and a polar bear, two species in the same genus. Here's the hybrid, the growler bear.
That's kind of gross.
It is. So if we are going to consider them separate species, what needs to be true of these hybrids? They either have to have reduced viability, they have to have reduced fertility, or they just don't last for a number of generations. Yeah,
Is
Tori.
there such thing as a two-headed snake? If so,
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah, of course. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. We've already talked about morphological species concept. We've talked about ecological species. This is the fourth one that I told you we'll talk about later, but it's here and it's in the recording now. You can read about it, but again, we're going to save this discussion for chapter 25. Yeah,
Are
Lisa.
your PowerPoints available somewhere, or is it just on the recordings?
I'll put them all on the Google on our Google Classroom. Some of you haven't joined the Google Classroom yet,
I didn't know.
and but I invited you to it.
It
It does if you have the app.
It only no, it doesn't.
Yes, it does. It's Dr. Engel invited you to join.
I just went out to check my
Whatever. I was like,
literature, and then I
accept.
saw.
Well, go on Google Classroom. You'll find it. I put an announcement there, and I said we have a Google Classroom now. This is big.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got that. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, just leave that there. I'll take it. All right. So now the question is, yeah, Emma.
So you're like conjoined twins. Okay, so
Yes.
I know it's like they share the same body and they have different heads, but like, is there a case where like they share the same like legs and they have like different arms and stuff? Because I know like the thing is split completely.
Yeah. Well, what happens? It's not. So what happens is they're sharing a placenta, and they just develop too closely, and they end up fusing together in some places. Sometimes they can end up like only having one of a particular structure. Like sometimes they'll have like one spinal column, but that's rare. Usually they just have a place where they're conjoined together. Yeah. All right. So then the question is, and this is the last part of 24, the last main part of 24 that we're going to deal with, of how do we generate these barriers, right? We talked about, okay, they may be behaviorally isolated. They may be temporally isolated. They may have habitats that are isolated. But the question is, how do you actually generate those barriers? How do you generate those barriers? Okay? It makes sense?
Yes.
How do you generate those barriers? So what this portion says is it basically can occur in two ways. One, allopatric speciation, and in this one, they become geographically isolated. Geographically isolated. Then, and only then, do they become reproductively isolated. Okay, so first you have to get geographic isolation, and then you can get reproductive isolation. Either pre-zygotic or post-zygotic, doesn't matter, but at some point you have to get them geographically isolated first. And Emma, did you talk about like ice breaking apart and separating? What's that? Oh, that was, oh, I'm sorry. Issa, I apologize.
Oh.
Okay, sympatric speciation is there's no geographical isolation. So the reproductive isolation happens while the two populations are in the same place. That's really strange. How on earth does that happen? This one we're like, okay, like you separate them, they're in two different environments, microevolution is going to happen in both. Eventually, they should start to be different enough, and then we already know what happens when you put two closely related species in the same place. What happens?
They mate.
Sometimes, do they become more or less alike, typically?
More like. Less alike.
They typically become less alike to avoid competition, right? They partition the niche, you start to get character displacement, and they become less alike.
Is there a name for that?
Character displacement. Niche partitioning. Okay, so here is allopatric speciation on the left. The two species are now geographically isolated. You see that? The two populations are geographically isolated and develop into different species. Sympatric speciation, they are not geographically isolated, but they still develop into two different species. Okay, now which of these do you think is more common? Okay. A, raise your hand if you think it's A, allopatric speciation. Which one of these is more common? Allopatric speciation. So the reality is we see speciation happen. We can measure microevolution, we see that happen. We even see speciation happen. We have examples of speciation events. So we can actually determine which of these is more common. Now, which do you think is more common? A. Raise your hand if you think it's A. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Does everybody else think B, or are some people not going to vote? Raise your hand if you think it's B.
B, for sure.
1, 2, 3, 4 with a question mark. Okay. A is by far more common. And so here's some support for this. Regions with a number of geographical barriers, like a chain of islands, or a series of lakes, or like Hawaii, or a series of lakes like you have in Michigan and Minnesota. The Philippines are another archipelago. Regions with many geographical barriers typically have a lot more species than regions with fewer barriers. So that's one evidence to support that allopatric speciation is more common. Another one is that the reproductive isolation tends to increase with distance apart. So if you take, say, 2 species on 2 really close islands in the Galapagos archipelago, they're probably not going to be as reproductively isolated as if you took 2 species on opposite ends of the archipelago. Again, further evidence that allopatric speciation is more common. And it just makes sense, right? Like, we separate them geographically, and then they're in 2 different environments. Microevolution is going to work in both populations, and you're going to generate some reproductive isolation. All right? Okay, so listen. Go onto the Google Classroom. Get involved, because I'm going to post a homework assignment on our Google Classroom today for you to do by Thursday. All right? Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Yeah, it's on the vocab.